Hello, and welcome to The Aesthetic Philosophy. I'm going to be doing a series on this channel where I dissect some of my favorite novels, along with novels that I perhaps didn't so much as enjoy, as I feel that are valuable and have something to be gained by reading. The novel that I'm going to be discussing today is The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. The Brothers Karamazov is a novel that follows the sons of Fyodor Karamazov. Dmitry, Ivan, and Alexei are all brothers but with very different personalities that often keen to the stereotypical ideas of moral obligation. Dmitry is much like his father and is impulsive and often driven to follow his lusts. Ivan is an intellectual driven by his doubts and a man who considers himself a realist, however can be portrayed as a pessimist. Alexei is religious and kind, which will later become a connotation that Dostoevsky uses to argue the link between religion and morality. Alexei is almost an idealistic take on what it is to be a man, and of that a religious man. The central philosophical conflict of the Brothers Karamazov is the conflict between religious faith and doubt. The main characters illustrate the different kinds of behavior that these two positions generate. Faith in the novel refers to the positive, and the belief in God practiced by characters such as Zoshima and Alyosha lends itself to an active love of mankind, kindness, and an overall positive experience as a human being, in almost devotion to goodness. Doubt in the novel refers to the kind of logical skepticism that characters such as Ivan Karamazov practice, and which, in pursuing the truth through logical examination of evidence, lends itself to the rejection of God and the rejection of conventional notions of morality, an almost coldness towards mankind, and in turn a crippling inner despair. Dostoevsky does not present these positions neutrally, however. Having been a religious man himself, he actively takes the side of faith and illustrates through innumerable examples how a life of faith is happier than that of a life of doubt. As we see in Smerdykov's murder of Fyodor Pavlovich, in Ivan's breakdown which leads only to chaos and unhappiness. In a 21st century mindset is that although we may not be religious, as there are a growing number of people who take on the notion of being either atheist or even agnostic, it is important to have something that you believe in per se, a sort of morality, and not perhaps a religious morality, although that is often what we abide to by the consequence of there being a law force. We have to have something to look forward to and something that we can strive towards. Otherwise, we do become nihilistic, a theme that is often seen throughout many different novels, especially Dostoevsky's novels, and greatly explored in another novel that I will be covering, which is the novel Demons, or The Devils, or The Possessed. There are many different names for it. Through the character of Ivan, in chapters such as The Grand Inquisitor, Dostoevsky presents an incisive case against religion, the church, and God, suggesting the choice to embrace religious faith can only be made at great philosophical risk, and for reasons that defy full logical explanation. However, he defutes most of these claims in such a chapter. In addition to this, the novel forcefully argues that people have free will whether they wish to or not. That is, on closer inspection, that every individual is free to choose whether to believe or disbelieve in God, whether to accept or reject morality, and whether to pursue good or evil. The condition of free will may seem to be a blessing, guaranteeing the spiritual independence of each individual and ensuring that no outside force can control the individual's choices with regard to faith. However, throughout the Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky portrays free will as a curse, and one that particularly plagues those characters who have chosen to doubt God's existence. Free will can be seen as a curse because it places a crippling burden on humanity to involuntarily and voluntarily reject the securities of comforts, protections of the world in favor of the uncertainties and the hardships of religious belief. Most people are too weak to make this choice, Ivan argues, and that most people are therefore doomed to be unhappy. Perhaps one of the most famous chapters in the entire book is one by the title of The Grand Inquisitor, which is in Book 5, and it explores Christ's biblical rejection of the temptations offered to him by Satan, and concludes that Christ was wrong to have rejected them, since his rejection won free will for humanity but took away security. Nevertheless, the condition of free will is finally shown to be a necessary component of the simple and satisfying faith as practiced by Alyosha and Zoshima, and the novel's optimistic conclusion suggests that perhaps people are not as weak as Ivan believes them to be. Another central lesson of the novel is that people should not judge one another, and should forgive one another's sins, and should pray for the redemption of criminals rather than their punishment, which can be seen as a slightly more modern viewpoint in regards to the context of the novel and the religious overview of such a belief. Zoshima explains that in his loving forgiveness, it is necessary because the chain of human causation is so interwoven that everyone bears some responsibility for the sins of everyone else. That is, that one person's actions have so many complicated effects on the actions of so many other people that it is impossible to trace all the consequences of any single action. If we look at this again from a 21st century perspective, we could see that when we sometimes judge criminals, and we are often quick to, we fail to understand that there are probably other factors that had led to such a sin as it is regarded by our moral values. We fail to see that things such as poverty and lack of education and a whole host of social and economic factors often lead people into crime, people who otherwise may not have caused the crime, and therefore we should be focusing on forgiveness and remaking someone's moral value. Everything that we do as human beings is influenced by innumerable actions of those around us, and therefore the idea of shared responsibility is abhorrent to the characters in the novel who doubt God and Christianity, especially Ivan, who repeatedly insists that he is not responsible for the actions of anyone but himself. Ivan's arguments, however, counter a belief in mutual responsibility, since he believes that without God or an afterlife, there is no moral law. In a world which the absence of God makes moral distinctions meaningless, people are logically justified in simply acting out their desires. Additionally, Ivan's deep distrust of human nature makes him inclined to keep the rest of humanity at a chilly distance, and the idea that the things he does that affect other people, it makes him extremely emotionally uncomfortable throughout the novel when confronted with such things. This can be seen when Smerdyakov explains to Ivan how Ivan's amoral philosophical beliefs have made it possible for Smerdyakov to kill Fyodor Pavlovich. Ivan is suddenly forced to accept the harshest consequences of his relentless skepticism. Not only has his doubt paved the way for murder, but he has no choice but to admit his own complicity in the execution of that murder. Ivan suddenly understands the nature of moral responsibility, as it had formerly been explained by Zoshima. A common theme throughout almost all Dostoyevsky's novels is the exploration of crime and justice, most famously in his novel Crime and Punishment, which I will likely be covering at a later date. In the context of the novel's larger exploration of sin, redemption, and justice, a major motif in this novel is the idea of crime and criminal justice. The crimes portrayed in the novel are also sins or crimes against God, and the novel presents them in such a way as to suggest that human beings are not capable of passing judgment on one another. The only true judge, as we see in the aftermath of Dmitry's wrongful conviction, is the conscious. Images of criminal justice in the novel occur most prominently in the debate between Ivan and the monks about ecclesiastical courts, and in the story of the Grand Inquisitor, and in Dmitry's arrest, imprisonment, and trial, all of which have in common the idea of not having some authoritative figure tell you that you've done wrong, but having it be yourself who knows you have done wrong. In a almost strange link to this, there is a very common theme throughout almost any novel that presents crime. A central part of Dostoyevsky's exploration of spiritual redemption is the idea that self-knowledge is necessary for a person to be redeemed. As Zoshima explains in Book 1, only when a man knows himself and faces himself honestly can he come to love others and love God. The principal way to arrive at that self-knowledge is through suffering. Suffering can occur either through the grief or guilt of sin, or, as in the case of Grushenka and Ivan, through the agony of illnesses that are metaphors for spiritual conditions. Apart from the sufferings of Grushenka and Ivan, the other major embodiment of this motif in the novel is Dmitry, who suffers through the mystery of realizing his own evil before he can fully embrace his goodness. When Lise willfully slams her fingers on the door, she provides another, bitterly ironic instance of the motif. Lise wants to punish herself for being wicked, but her idea of suffering is so shallow, vain, and ridiculous that it is not a serious attempt at redemption. Although at surface level, the Brothers Karamazov is a fundamentally exploration of religious faith, the novel does support the idea that the choice to believe in God cannot be fully explained in rational terms. Profound and inexplicable gestures often take the place of argumentative dialogue, and these gestures defy exploration, but convey, in a poetic sense, of the qualities that make faith necessary and satisfying for the human soul. Examples of these are profound and enigmatic. Gestures include Zoshima kneeling before Dmitry in Book 1, Christ kissing the Grand Inquisitor in Book 5, Alyosha kissing Ivan in the same book, Zoshima embracing the earth just before he dies in Book 6, and Alyosha kissing the ground after his dream in Book 7. Each of these gestures can only be partially explained. Zoshima, for example, kneels before Dmitry to acknowledge the suffering Dmitry will face. But none of these gestures can be fully explained, and their ambiguity is a way of challenging the rational paradigm that Ivan embraces, the rationale that cannot perhaps be explained and is very much linked to the idea of redemption through self-suffering and self-conviction. Due to the fact that the Brothers Karamazov is a realistic novel and a philosophical novel, Dostoyevsky's characterizations tend to yield fully drawn, believable individuals who also represent certain qualities and ideas bearing on the larger philosophical arguments as presented by the novel. The drama acted out between the characters becomes the drama of the larger ideas in conflict with one another. Most of the important symbols in the novels, then, are characters. Most every major character in the novel embodies a concept. For instance, Alyosha represents faith, Ivan represents doubt, and Fyodor Pavlovich represents selfishness and greed, along with a physical appetite. Some characters have more specific designations. Smerdyakov, for instance, works primarily as a living symbol of Fyodor Pavlovich's wickedness and how his rejection of his son, essentially, led to what happened to him ultimately. When we explore the Brothers Karamazov, it's important to look at Zoshima's corpse, which, although seeming rather strange, there's a lot of meaning held behind it. The monks, including Alyosha, all expect Zoshima's death to be followed by a great miracle that will commemorate his extraordinary wisdom and virtue in life. They even expect that he will prove to be a saint. In a monolithic lore, one of the ways in which he was a saint can be detected after his death is that his corpse, rather than emitting the stench of decay, is instead suffused with a pleasant smell. After Zoshima's death, however, no miracle occurs. Moreover, Zoshima's corpse begins to stink very quickly, excluding a particularly strong and putrid odor, which is taken by his enemies in the monastery as proof of his inner corruption. For Alyosha, who craves a miracle, the indignity visited upon Zoshima's corpse exemplifies the lack of validation with which the world often rewards religious faith. The fate of Zoshima's corpse suggests that faith is not justified by miracles, rather that the person who chooses faith must do so in defiance of the many reasons to doubt. When we look at this today, people who do choose to follow a faith have to do so in rejection to what is commonly seen as realistic atheism. So let's take a more general overview of the novel. The tone of the novel, or the narrator's tone, is one of serious comedy. He takes his story very seriously and comprehends the importance of each of the questions that it raises, but nevertheless writes with a warm and linguistic intentiveness that somehow masks the coldness and almost sadness of his subject. So, when you read the novel, although it's Dostoevsky's longest novel, it is a quick read and almost writes itself as a pulp novel, which almost contradicts the deep and heavy philosophical topics that it covers. When you read the Brothers Karamazov, although seeming completely irrelevant to some modern day issues, when you take a deeper dive, it really does influence the way you think about certain philosophical topics of the past, which can lead to certain decisions that you make in the modern era that we live in. Although at surface level being a novel that primarily discusses beliefs of religion and doubt and almost propagates that you should have religious belief, I think you can take the novel to be that not so much you need to be a believer in the God that Dostoevsky believed in, but so that you have to have a belief in something, whether that to be a belief in a goal or an idealism or a romanticization of something, even to that extent. I think when I read the Brothers Karamazov that the message that underlies the idea between doubt and faith is one of optimism, and how, although it is important to be both realistic, optimism is important and often overlooked. Dostoevsky explores in his other novels, such as The Idiot and also Demons, the stupidity and almost the skepticism that many people look at optimists with. However, it's important to have all facets of this. I don't believe that you should either just be a realist, pessimist, or optimist, and even if you are more inclined to be one of those three, you should have all facets of that. You shouldn't just be one dimension, and optimism is important. Optimism leads to fulfillment because optimism gives you something to strive towards. So, in conclusion, I definitely believe that you should read this novel. It is one of my favorites. I would say maybe even one of my top 3 novels. Definitely give it a go. If you're feeling intimidated by its size, I really wouldn't be. It could be quite difficult to push into at first. However, once you begin reading it, it quickly starts to flow. And there are plenty of resources online that could help you digest some of the bigger ideas of the novel, and perhaps this is one of those resources. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider subscribing or giving it a thumbs up. I would really appreciate it. And yeah, I look forward to maybe having you listen to another one of these and suggest any novels that you would like me to discuss in the future. So thank you for listening. I give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and I hope you have a nice day.